Dr. Miller, PhD, as always, doubling up on the credentials for the ego, because I can't really save anybody's life like the MD doctor. So I have to make myself feel better for giving me the rest on the papers. So I double up with the doctor PhD. This is Journal Club 41, supposedly. I think it might be 42. I messed up that numbering a while back. So we'll say 41. All right, another weightlifting study. Might be the last one for a bit. I'll try to mix it up. This one is, even if you're not interested in snatch and clean jerk, you might find this interesting to some degree just to think about a new cluster set variation. So this exercise, was about traditional sets. So in this case, doing power snatches, so not catching in a fully catch position, a squat position, the power snatches. So barbell, if you're not familiar, barbell from the floor to overhead, catching not in parallel. That was the whole context of the studies. Don't get to parallel. And then, using that as the exercise, what's the difference in technique that occurs from a traditional set of 5 or a cluster set of 5? So if you're not familiar with the cluster set, you do a rep, you rest for 30 seconds. Do a rep, rest for 30 seconds, no load changes, and then you rest 3 minutes between sets, just like with traditional sets. So that was how this study was done, 3-minute rest between sets. But within this set, there was rest. So inter-rep rest. Okay, and then the third condition was an ascending. So the load was added every rep as the lifter rested between clusters. Okay, so that might be interesting. So if you're into weightlifting, you might find this of interest. If you're just interested in sets and reps and how it might affect power performance, this could be of interest too. I'm not saying that this would extend to clean and jerk or deadlifting or something else. I'm just saying this is interesting to look at and how it affects the technique. All right. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, hit the notification. I don't know if I said this right. I'm going to be honest with you. I recorded this video already going through this study, and I realized because you can't see one of these figures, the outcome measures can be really, I got really mired in all the gobbledygook. So I'm going to summarize a lot of this here. This is going to be a shorter one, more than likely. It's certainly shorter than the first one I recorded. So if I said this already, I'm sorry. I can't remember. But do subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell. Like this video if you like it. Check out my ever-growing library of journal clubs, book clubs, and hopefully to come soon this month, educational videos. Leave a comment below what you'd like me to talk about. Muscle physiology, biomechanics. Don't just say muscle physiology, but like specifically, what do you want to know? Okay? How do muscles contract? How do they adapt? Biomechanics, we can talk about that. Nutrition, again, let me know. I'll happy to be guided by those that might be interested. 254 subs at the time of this video, going for 1,000 for that Lambo lifestyle. Just chasing the money. That's all this is about. That's why I went education, because everybody knows education's where the money's at. Yeah. Effective different set configurations on barbell trajectories during the power snatch by Nagatani et al. In the International Journal of Sports Science and Coaching, published in 2022. The second author was Dr. Half, who's done a lot of research in weightlifting and in cluster sets. So not surprising. All right, who did this study? We got 10 folks. Let me pull that page up. Again, I recorded this earlier, and I went through all the work, and then I realized this is just such a garbled up mess. I actually want this to be edifying for anybody that would listen to this. So I'm going to try to keep it, some of the details to a minimum here, but 10 strength power athletes. As always, looking for what's the strength power strength / 1RM ratio to their body mass was 0.88, and the study was set the minimum at 0.7, so they exceeded at 0.88. I'd say 0.8 would be pretty good for power snatch, 1RM to body mass, right? Average age of individuals about 29 plus or minus 4.5 years. Okay. They had to been doing the power snatch for at least 6 months prior to participation in the study. So there was 4 days of the study. First day was a 1RM testing day. It had 5 reps to take a shot at it. If there's a warm-up, of course, that's detailed here. Typical warm-up, a 1RM. If there was a fail at a 1RM, the individual was allowed to take one more rep. See if they could try to hit that rep. 3 minutes rest between sets. All right. Now, with all these studies that I've done studies like this too, so I'm not being critical. It's just a limitation of the research I've done and the research of others done. Certainly, I'm not a prolific researcher, but when you do a 1RM day, there was a 72, 96 hour time period between each of the other assessment. So there was 4 days. There's a 1RM day, then there was the day that the individuals did the traditional set, 3 sets of 5, or a set of 5, and then the day they did a cluster set with the 30-second rest in between set, and then the ascending cluster set where their load was increasing. And I'll explain that in a second. Well, I mean, even if you randomize them, which I believe they did, it's a counterbalance design. is that the last day is still going to be subjected to fatigue and subjected to changes to 1RM. Now, again, by randomizing the order, you kind of work around that, of course. But just keep that in mind that that's a limitation. That's difficult to do, but you're talking about a long period of time from the initial 1RM testing to the final testing day, the final intervention day. Okay, the final day where you're trying out one of these different set configurations. Just something to consider. I'm not even being critical of that because I have the same problem when I do research. The only thing you do is test 1RM all the time or not use 1RM, or use some other manner, but then it gets more complex. So keep that in mind. All right. Now this is where things can get mired down a little bit. Let me back up for a second. Let me make sure I'm clear on what these individuals were doing. There's a really nice figure that's really well done in terms of explaining the study. I always like graphical descriptions of experimental design. That's nice. So 3 sets I mentioned before. The traditional set was, the load was 75% of 1RM. The traditional set was all reps in a row, rest 3 minutes. The cluster was rep, 30-second rest, rep, 30-second rest for all 5 reps, rest 3 minutes for 3 sets. And then the final one was a little bit different, and I've done this before with athletes. I think I usually use it as more of a drop, but I've also done this as well with the ascending. So in other words, remember 75% was the load for the other 2 conditions. 75% was the average 1RM for the ascending. So the first rep was 65%, the second rep was 70%, the next was 75%, the next 80%, and the last is 85%. So the load got heavier within the set. So 30-second rest, hit a heavier load, okay? And then rested 3 minutes, all right? And the outcome, though, was it wasn't power or any of these things. It was how does this particular construction, set construction of all 3, how does it affect technique? All right. Now, I'm going to mention these things, but I'm just going to summarize the results then. There's a nice figure in here, and this is from Dr. Stone's research. I can't remember. I think I thought I did a journal club about it. Maybe I didn't. But basically, the reason I was interested, there's a lot of weightlifting studies, and to be honest with you, it's like after a while, it's like, okay, limit horizontal displacement, cool. But I was actually interested how much horizontal displacement in the negative. In other words, if you start, with the barbell on the floor, and if we're thinking about the x-axis, as you pull the bar, it moves into the body. I was looking at some of the old videos of some of these small weight class Japanese women that were in the Olympic Games, and they had some pretty unique technique where they're leaning back on purpose and jumping back significantly. And the idea was trying to leverage the bar to get it behind them. They have a better chance to catch it. And they're trying to use some leverage too in order to lean back on that bar to lift heavier loads as a smaller athlete. But I was interested, how much hop back is good, right? If you notice some of the lifters, they hop back a little bit. Well, how much is too much? Well, Dr. Stone, though, kind of in another way figured out something. I was roughly, if there's 10 centimeters ahead of the foot, so if somebody catches the bar 10 centimeters ahead of the toe, they had a 64% fail rate. And the best pattern, if I remember the same study, the best pattern was a backwards type S. So S means the barbell travels toward the knee as the knees go back and the bar rises in what's called the first pull typically, and then around the knee it has scoop, double knee bend, and stuff not to worry about if you just know how to lift. If you just taught how to lift properly, it takes care of itself. But then the bar gets in the second pull where it gets to the hip, and that's the most accelerative part of the lift. So around the knee transition to the second pull, hit the hip, and then some people call it a third pull when you get into the bar. Okay. Now there's this thing called loop, right? If you're familiar with exercise, that's when the barbell comes out far away from the body. You want to limit horizontal displacement. And so when the bar hits the hip, or if it hits off the thigh, depending on the grip, right? The further the bar is bounced, I see this a lot in CrossFit, right? Trying to hit the bar hard with the hip or the thigh and pushing the bar away from midline and pushing the bar away and creating greater horizontal displacement. You don't want that. Okay. So this study had different levels of horizontal displacement measured by whether it's from the toe to the finishing position or the barbell tip to the finishing position, or how much from the hip was the greatest amount of loop that occurred in front of the individual. Like they measured that in this sagittal plane and side view in 2D analyses in order to figure out, I think it was 2D analyses. Was it? 3D. 3D analyses, even better. 3D analyses in order to track bar path. There's all these coaching apps now out there and all this other stuff that can track your bar path, right? So the idea was, how is a technique affected? It wasn't a performance study per se, in the sense of like, is the ascending cluster better in the long term for producing better lifting? No, it wasn't about that. It was about how is performance affected or technique affected by these different set structures. In short, the only the only significant result, at least when it came to just looking at means of each one of these different measurements of barbell horizontal displacement, and I'm just looking for it here. I lost it here. The only one that was significant was the using the ascending cluster set. Not surprisingly, the barbell height was significantly lower in the final rep as compared to the first rep, and here we go, and the DL, which is I'll explain this one briefly. Again, this is where I got bogged down last time, and I don't want to do this again because there's all these DXLs, DXVs, DX2, right, and these different classifications. But DXL, if you can kind of visualize this now, is the distance from the hip to the greatest horizontal displacement in front of the body. This is, from not the hip, I'm sorry, from the finish. So, how far from where the barbell got out in front of the individual, the furthest part that they got out in front of the individual, like the loop, to where the finish, right? You'd hope that DL would be pretty tight. So the top of the S, right? We come up and the barbell goes overhead and then you catch it. Okay. That was the only significant change as well, is that DL was less advantageous. In other words, it had less backwards displacement, which is what you want from that initial rep. So in other words, there's a greater loop. How's that? So there's a greater loop that occurred. The bar didn't get as high because it was heavier in that last rep too. It was 85%, keep in mind. And the loop certainly probably contributed that as well. And so that was the only significant result when we're just kind of looking at the means and standard deviations. Now, the authors also included the Hedges G or Cohen's G. There's a fight over, like, Hedges is more appropriate. Effect sizes with 90% magnitude confidence interval. And if you're not familiar with effect sizes, it's simply anything over 0.2 is considered trivial. They did a nice job explaining to 0.2 to 0.5, is usually considered small, and moderate effect is 0.6 of 1.19. Okay, so effect sizes are nice ways to tease out whether a result that's statistically significant with mean and standard deviation, right, use is actually meaningful. Okay, and looking at these effect sizes with their 95% confidence intervals, there was a clear trend here. Not surprising that the cluster set, and I'm not going to go through each one of these because this is where I got bogged down the first time when I made this video. In fact, I even edited this again because without seeing the actual diagram of these different displacements, it's a little bit hard to kind of visualize what I'm saying. Bottom line, though, is just like the statistics on the mean standard deviations, is that catch height was there's a significant effect of catch height on the ascending, right? The ascending set. Okay, so from first to the fifth rep. Not a surprise there. There was a small effect size in the traditional. Okay, the only other moderate, or I would just say the largest effect size, occurred in the DL again, so this confirmed what we saw, is that the bigger the loop was, right? But the ascending cluster set, there was a greater loop that occurred. Okay, and that was the moderate, what they called a moderate effect size. The rest of the effect sizes were either trivial or small. All right, now just kind of eyeballing this thing. Okay, the cluster sets that the traditional cluster set, not surprising in my opinion, had a much smaller confidence interval. So I mean, there's less variability in the effect, and tended to hug that negative, or it tended to hug the zero effect size. Right, so it didn't hurt and didn't help the technique that occurred in the lift. Now, this is just me eyeballing these trends. This is a really nice little figure in here. If I was going to pick one of these three, not surprisingly, I would, if at 75%. Now, granted, this could be different as it gets heavier load. If you're talking about a full snatch, clean and jerk, this could all change. But I still think it's interesting when you look at these results that it looks like, in terms of technique, the most advantageous one, and that's what I'm trying to get at with this whole study, the most advantageous set configuration would be the traditional cluster set. Would be the traditional of these three. So better than a traditional, which 5 reps is quite a few reps, I think. 75% is doable, but you're going to see a drop off in performance. Clusters, those little 30-second rests, right? They're going to be longer to do this, but it has a more advantageous effect on technique, where the ascending cluster set as the load got heavier, as opposed to the traditional where fatigue was maybe more of an issue as a result of the volume. Here, the load is maybe more of the driver of fatigue and the detrimental effect on technique. Okay, that's it. That's all I got. That's enough. Again, it's easy. This is a study that's best viewed than talked about, and you're like, why did you do this? Because I still think it's interesting. I know a lot of I talk about sets and reps configuration. I thought it was interesting to see this ascending cluster set in a research study. The outcome measurement, again, wasn't performance per se. It was on technique, but we can say that, not surprising that maybe putting the heaviest rep last is not a good idea. I would like to have seen it maybe done another way, like a descending, right, where you do the heaviest rep first and then backpedal and see how, if technique is held together really well throughout all these sets. Like catch height is enhanced as a result of some post-activation potentiation. That might be an interesting configuration to go the other way rather than go from light to heavy, go from heavy to light, more of a drop load, descending a pyramid type of style of set. If you're going to do something and try to maximize technique, and I use cluster sets all the time. My cluster sets are a little bit wonky sometimes, though. I'll do things like, I use them if I do in weightlifting, I'll do 2+1, things like that, 30-second rest. But when I use them, you've probably seen, if not, go look at my video on cluster sets, like a 5+5 in the squat. It's like a front squat technique fails. A lot of people get turtle backed pretty quickly. And so if you can do 10 reps of a front squat, that's pretty tough to hold that position. And so doing 5 reps and then resting for 30 seconds, right? You could do 3+3+3+3, right? If you're doing sets of 12 but only have 15-second rest. So hypertrophy is the goal, right? You're not going to get, there's probably more, from a little bit of research I've seen this, you get more out of doing a straight set because there's some metabolic fatigue that likely occurs there. That's helpful in growing muscles. But when it comes to maintaining, it's one of those things that if you can't maintain the technique, though, to do the exercise correctly, what good is it to try to grind out the set, right? So there's some quality issues that occur, and that when I've seen the trade-off for hypertrophy gains is not worth it to not cluster. How's that? So at least in exercises where technique is going to be a big problem as fatigue starts to ramp up, like some of your barbell squatting movements. So just keep that in mind. It's probably why this study was also interesting to me as well. All right. Hopefully you stuck with it. I know it's not the most terribly exciting study, but it's interesting nonetheless. If you have any questions or I botched or garbled up something, let me know and I'm happy to clarify. If not, I'll see you in the next video.